Greetings and welcome to Gripping Horror. Ice diving and cave diving are similar in that both take place in extreme, confined environments where direct access to the surface is limited. In each, divers must navigate back to specific entry points, making emergencies extremely more dangerous. Both require precise navigation, reliance on safety lines, and specialized equipment due to low visibility and freezing conditions. Any mistake or equipment failure in these environments can quickly turn fatal. In the Arctic Ocean, 500 miles north of Barrow, Alaska, the Coast Guard cutter Healy was on a mission unlike any other. At 3:55 p.m. on August 17, 2006, this icebreaker wasn't just cutting through the frozen seas. It was pushing boundaries, exploring uncharted waters, and conducting critical scientific research for the future of marine science. In the late afternoon hours of this summer day, 3 Coast Guard divers from the cutter Healy attempted to conduct cold water familiarization dives at a planned depth of 20 feet of seawater during an ice liberty stop on the Arctic ice. After one of the divers exited the water due to an equipment malfunction, the 2 remaining divers continued the dive in 29-degree Fahrenheit waters. A routine training dive meant to strengthen the skills of the crew will become one of the deadliest days in US Coast Guard history, with many lessons learned from this tragic event. Lieutenant Jessica Hill, born in Saranac Lake, New York, and raised in St. Augustine, Florida, was a 30-year-old marine science officer aboard the USCGC Healy, in charge of executing every last detail of Healy's unprecedented science missions, from start to finish, including science support diving. Hill reported aboard the Healy in the best shape of her life because Arctic science diving requires it. With a master's degree in marine science from the University of South Alabama, she was passionate about the ocean and science, excelling in her role as the liaison between the ship's crew and scientists. Jessica was also the vessel's dive officer, having completed the rigorous Navy dive school in Panama City, Florida, where she stood out among her peers. Unfortunately, that's not all she was asked to do. A bare-bones crew on the technologically advanced Healy makes perfect sense, except that there must be enough qualified people to drive it. Jessica at one point drove the Healy 3 times a day for 4-hour stretches, every day. As if that weren't enough, she also performed the duties of dive officer, assistant operations officer, morale officer, and civil rights officer. Known for her vibrant personality, intelligence, and physical strength, Jessica was admired by her colleagues and loved by her family. Petty Officer 2nd Class Stephen Duke, a 26-year-old from Miami, Florida, was also aboard the Healy. He was a driven and hard-working boatswain's mate in the Coast Guard. Raised in the vibrant city of Miami, Stephen found his calling in the Coast Guard, where he quickly worked his way through the ranks. Though relatively new to cold water diving, having used a dry suit only once during training, Stephen was determined to take on the challenge of diving in the Arctic. His colleagues admired him for his professionalism, dedication, and ability to inspire others to take their responsibilities seriously. Stephen approached his work with a deep sense of purpose, and joining the dive team above the Healy marked a significant step in his career. Since its inception in 1790 as a tariff collection service, the United States Coast Guard has seen its workload multiply exponentially. The USCGC Healy is a state-of-the-art polar-class icebreaker and one of the most advanced vessels in the US Coast Guard fleet, commissioned on August 28, 1999. Named after Captain Edward H. Healy, this formidable cutter stretches 420 feet in length and is equipped with a reinforced hull that enables it to break through ice up to 8 feet thick. With a displacement of approximately 16,000 tons, the Healy combines diesel and gas turbine propulsion, allowing it to navigate the challenging conditions of the Arctic and Antarctic regions. Unlike its sister ships, Polar Star and Polar Sea, the Healy is a science platform first, icebreaker second. It plays host to a greater number of Arctic scientists than the Coast Guard has ever accommodated before. Its primary mission is to conduct scientific research, boasting sophisticated laboratories that support disciplines such as oceanography, biology, and geology. The cutter facilitates access for other research vessels, providing logistical support for vital studies related to climate change and marine ecosystems. In addition to its scientific endeavors, the Healy engages in search and rescue operations and law enforcement, playing a critical role in enforcing US laws in the maritime domain. As the Arctic becomes increasingly significant due to climate shifts and resource exploration, the Healy stands as a vital asset for national security and environmental research, contributing essential insights into one of the world's most rapidly changing regions. The diving officer, Lieutenant Jessica Hill, was the most experienced diver assigned to the vessel and was the only qualified diving supervisor. Her total diving experience was 2 years and 3 months, with 24 dives performed since completing dive school, of which 0 were conducted in cold water scuba. Stephen had been a qualified diver for 5 months and had 2 career dives since completing dive school, of which 0 were performed in cold water scuba. Unfortunately, both Jessica and Stephen lacked experience in cold water scuba diving, a critical skill needed for the dive that took place on August 17, 2006. In addition, Stephen Duke had not conducted a dive in the 10 months preceding the mishap. The commanding officer, Captain Douglas Russell, the executive officer, Commander Robert D. Henneman, and the operations officer, Lieutenant Commander Sharon L. Allen, were also not qualified divers and had not received formal diving operations training. The 420-foot icebreaker had been on a research mission and stopped for the first time in a month in the late afternoon hours of the 17th of August, 2006. The ship stopped on the ice for liberty, including several recreational type events and alcohol consumption. The air temperature was 28 degrees Fahrenheit, and the water temperature was 29 degrees Fahrenheit. Winds were 8 knots. Ice covering was 9/10, with a thickness of 3 to 4 feet of multi-year pack. The below ice water depth was estimated at 1,420 meters, or 4,649 feet. On the morning of the planned ice liberty, the diving officer, Lieutenant Jessica Hill, recognized the opportunity to perform a dive, while many other crew members were drinking beer and hard lemonade and playing football as part of approved liberty. The ship's divers were very inexperienced, and the belief was this was an excellent opportunity to create proficiency and maintain qualification for the dive team. The submitted plan identified 3 divers performing cold water dives in single scuba with full face masks. All divers would wear dry suits and buoyancy compensators. Lieutenant Jessica Hill would be the diving supervisor and would perform this task while actively participating in the dive as a working diver. Petty Officers Second Class David J. Penning and Stephen Duke would dive with Jessica. No standby diver was assigned. The dive tenders would be the ship's force personnel that were not military dive qualified and were responsible for monitoring the divers during their dive. They had limited training and received only basic instructions on the line pull signals used during scuba diving. The commanding officer, Captain Douglas Russell, operating officer, Lieutenant Commander Robert C. Smith, Stephen Duke, and one dive tender posed questions to Dive Officer Lieutenant Jessica Hill regarding the plan's validity. Jessica assured each of them the dive was permitted by diving policy. The chain of command determined the dive to be a routine operation with minimal risk and approved. The commanding officer, Captain Douglas Russell, who was responsible for the safe conduct of all dive operations, lacked familiarity with the dive procedures, which is why he approved the plan. The entire approval process took approximately 30 minutes without the required risk assessments and checkout procedures. Jessica alone told the command cadre that the dive was within regulations, even though, according to Navy regulations, the team would have needed at least 4 qualified divers to conduct the exercise, 2 in the water, 1 on standby, and a dive supervisor. On the day of the dive, the area was not cordoned off from the Ice Liberty revelers as required by the Navy Diving Manual, which is used along with the US Coast Guard Diving Manual. There was no dive log, no time kept at the dive site, and the Navy Dive Manual was not at the site, contrary to regulations. The site was 60 feet off the port bow of the Healy, but out of view of the pilot house. Additionally, there was no communication link between the dive team and wheelhouse. The dive station was set up on the open ice, with no shelter. Stephen arrived with equipment 40 minutes before Jessica and David, but as he waited for the other divers who were delayed, he lay down on the ice, an action prohibited by the Navy Dive Manual because it can cause heat loss and equipment failure. With no protection, diving equipment was staged directly on the ice. Jessica recruited a few crew members partying nearby as dive tenders. They had no training or experience in the work. 2 of the tenders had been drinking. However, Jessica and Stephen had not taken part in the Ice Liberty and hadn't been drinking before the dive. Once the remaining divers and dive tenders were on station and ready, Jessica performed an informal dive brief that included basic instructions to the dive tenders of the meaning of the line pull signals used during scuba diving. 1 tug means, "Okay," she had told the tenders. 1 tug upon descent, however, according to the Navy Dive Manual, the Bible for military divers, also means stop. None of the tenders remembers her telling them that. No formal checklists were used, and no operation risk management brief was conducted. Once the dive brief and tender familiarization training were completed, the tenders assisted the divers with donning the equipment. All divers were equipped with a single steel 100 cubic foot tank, full face AGA mask with an additional regulator, a dry suit, and a buoyancy compensator with 40 pounds of weight distributed between the jettison pockets and the zippered utility pockets. The dry suit inflation hose was connected to the first stage regulator, but the buoyancy compensator inflators were not. Jessica and Stephen wore split fins, which are designed for speed and provide minimal thrust. None of the divers wore weight belts, as required, which allow to get rid of weight in an emergency. The dive plan specified that on the first dive, divers would go to 20 feet. All 3 divers entered the water and conducted in-water checks. Almost immediately, David had water intrusion into his dry suit. The suit inflation would not operate, and he could not maintain proper buoyancy. He discussed these issues with Lieutenant Jessica Hill, and they decided that David would return to the dive locker to search for a new dry suit. He exited the water and departed the dive station. While David was dealing with his equipment issues, Jessica and Stephen determined they were too buoyant and added approximately 10 additional pounds of weight in their BCD for a total of around 60 pounds each, twice the recommended amount. The buoyancy control device has pockets to carry and, if necessary, jettison weight. However, Jessica and Stephen filled not only the weight pockets, but also the equipment pockets of the buoyancy control device. Thus, much of the diver's weight was not easily jettisonable. This posed a serious danger, increasing the risk of decompression sickness, commonly known as the bends. Once they made the final adjustments, Jessica and Stephen descended below the surface without David. Approximately 5 minutes into the dive, Stephen experienced water intrusion into his gloves and had to exit the water to re-warm his hands. Jessica remained in the water but was on the surface. After a 10-minute re-warming period, Stephen replaced his gloves and re-entered the water. It was noted that his hands were still cold and lacked the dexterity to make the standard OK hand signal, so it was agreed that the thumbs up signal would be used instead. It's unclear why Jessica chose not to call off the dive, despite the series of issues that had arisen. Both divers again descended below the surface. The tenders paid out some line, and Jessica and Stephen descended a few feet. Both were visible to the tenders when Jessica sent one line pull signal. The tenders understood this to mean the divers were okay, so they allowed more slack in the line. Tender number 1 observed both divers' lines paying out fairly quickly. Upon seeing that Jessica's line was close to being fully paid out, Tender 1 stepped on the line to stop it. Tender 1 then felt a single tug on the line and thus continued to pay out additional line. Tender number 2 initially observed the divers down to about 15 feet, but then lost sight. Jessica and Stephen appeared to go under the ice. The untrained dive tenders at first thought they might be still at 20 feet, but swimming under the ice. Early in the dive, tender number 2 felt a moderate strain on his line. He then became distracted by the ship's personnel engaging in ice liberty events that had encroached on the dive station and inadvertently stepped on a tending line. Approximately 3 minutes after the divers submerged, tender number 2 stated that the line sped out in a fast and forceful way that required him to ask for help from a bystander. The line paid out for about 15 seconds, slowed slightly for a few seconds, then again increased in speed. As the divers' lines sank faster and faster, the novice dive tenders grew increasingly confused and alarmed. Jessica and Stephen would have experienced a loss of buoyancy because air volume compresses at that level and provides less buoyancy. Divers wearing excessive weight would have to counteract the loss by adding air to their suits or jettisoning weight. As stated previously, the pair's added weights were zipped into their dry suit pockets, making it impossible for them to drop them. Believing that about 100 feet of line had paid out, tender number 2 and his assistant stopped the line and gave pulls on the line to which no return pull was received. Both dive tenders had permitted the line to pay out until there was not much left on the spool, and they were concerned they might lose the line because it was not anchored to the ice. The total bottom time at this point was approximately 10 minutes. Second Petty Officer David J. Finning returned to the dive station and quickly determined that something was wrong. 4 pulls were sent to both divers and no response was received. Tenders observing the dive failed to understand that the 2 had dropped to greater than planned depths until it was too late. At this point, David directed that both divers be recovered immediately. The total bottom time at this point was approximately 20 minutes. The tenders began retrieval of divers at an initial rate of 1 foot per minute. At about 40 feet, both divers could be seen and appeared to be unconscious. Jessica and Stephen ran out of air. Both divers were then rapidly recovered to the surface, pulled from the water, and resuscitation efforts started at approximately 6:48 p.m. Both Jessica and Stephen had been submerged for approximately 23 minutes. Jessica's depth gauge showed a maximum depth of 185 feet, and Stephen's depth gauge was maxed out, showing 200 feet. Both divers were unresponsive and lacked vital signs. Neither diver had jettisoned any weight. The crew on the surface attempted resuscitation, but they were not successful. Approximately 1 hour and 13 minutes after reaching the surface, both divers were pronounced dead at approximately 8 p.m. Stephen's air tank was depleted and Jessica's pressure was so low it was essentially empty. An autopsy found both divers died from lack of oxygen with severe air pressure damage to the lungs, including possible air bubbles in the circulatory system. The bottom line is that this dive should have never occurred. Had Healy's commanding officer, executive officer, operations officer, and dive team followed policies established in Coast Guard and Navy diving manuals, they would have not permitted diving operations. The investigation following this event identified over 70 human factors that either directly caused or contributed to this event. A human factor is considered causal when removal of that human factor from the sequence of events would likely have broken the chain of errors, and the mishap would not have occurred. A human factor is considered contributory when it is not singularly responsible for the mishap. However, when combined with causal or other contributory errors, it influenced the mishap's progression. Approximately 26 factors were determined causal, and 45 were contributory. Think about this. There were at least 26 opportunities to avoid this mishap, 26 chances to prevent the death of 2 military divers. The following is a condensed summary of the findings. 1. Command oversight. The chain of command did not properly assess the hazards associated with the dive, identify the procedural inadequacy of the plan, and did not prevent the operation from occurring when they had doubts about procedural compliance. 2. Planning. The plan presented by Jessica lacked technical competence and failed to comply with established procedures in all regards. 3. Training. The entire chain of command, every diver and every dive tender involved, lacked the training necessary to perform this dive safely. 4. Equipment. The divers were not outfitted with equipment suitable for this dive, were overweighted, and their BC inflators were not connected. The investigation also found that Jessica's diving certificate had lapsed. The Healy's previous commander in April signed one, but of the 4 dives in 6 months Jessica was to have made to requalify for her certification, 2 were later found to have been recreational, so they didn't count, the report said. Many military divers will have questions regarding the divers' emergency actions during this event. Why didn't they climb the tended line? Why didn't they inflate their dry suits? Why didn't they send out other line pull signals? Why didn't they ditch their weight? Although these questions can never be fully answered, physical task oversaturation could have been a factor. At a minimum, the divers would have had to 1. Recognize what was happening. 2. Clear their ears. 3. Inflate their dry suits. 4. Drop their weights. 5. Signal each other. And 6. Signal the tenders. Each task's number and complexity likely exceeded their training and ability to perform in such a compressed period of time, especially with hands that were too cold to make an OK sign and a dry suit that was likely squeezing them. Many red flags existed that should have resulted in stopping this dive. It is difficult to understand how so many things could have gone wrong to result in this tragedy. If you take one thing away from this mishap, please let it be that every person involved in a dive has the ability to ask questions, raise safety concerns, or provide better technical information to those involved. The military dive community rarely suffers a loss due to wartime action or essential military operations. It is the non-essential dives conducted for training or other routine events that result in the most fatalities, and those fatalities are most often a result of the actions of personnel, not equipment. Complex diving operations performed in arduous conditions are routinely completed without incident due to effective planning, training, qualification, and supervision. Remove one of those 4 essential factors, and even an easy dive becomes dangerous. The vessel's 3 top officers were found to be in dereliction of duty at an admiral's mast held on January the 11th. The commanding officer and operations officer received letters of reprimand. The executive officer received a letter of admonition. Pay forfeitures for the commanding officer and operations officer were suspended. Immediately following the accident, the Coast Guard instituted a number of changes in its dive program. It conducted a safety stand-down and inspections of all dive units, held training for divers who deployed last year on the icebreaker Polar Sea, and developed a dive training module for commanders at the prospective commanding officer and executive officer afloat course, and elsewhere. Their deaths will not be in vain if the actions proposed by the Coast Guard resulting from this investigation are implemented, and no other family member will go through what we have experienced, Jessica's family said. The sea, like the Arctic ice, is unforgiving, and in both, preparation is not just important, it is a matter of survival. Lieutenant Jessica Hill and Petty Officer Stephen Duke, though dedicated and driven, were failed by a series of lapses in judgment and protocol. Their tragic deaths stand as a stark reminder that even the most skilled and passionate individuals are not immune to the dangers of the environment when proper precautions are overlooked. Their loss was not just a tragedy, but a lesson, one that emphasizes the need for rigorous safety measures and respect for the unpredictability of nature. This has been gripping horror. I hope to see you in the next one.